Hey guys, it is me, the former film student, back today, and welcome to episode 3 of 31 Nights, 31 Frights, the series where I review a new horror film every day of October from the 1st all the way to the 31st. Some new, some old, some good, some bad, and everything in between. And today we're going to be talking about a true classic in the genre, one of my favorites, and a movie that is one of the earliest horror films that I can really remember actually just loving everything about it and just really enjoying the experience as a whole, and that is 1996's Scream. So, as I said, Scream came out in 1996 and was directed by Wes Craven, who is a true masterful director when it comes to horror. He created the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, as well as the Scream franchise. And the fact that he created two of probably the most prolific and popular horror franchises and two of the most iconic horror movie villains, I think, is just a testament to how good he is at the craft. He was so innovative, so creative, and such a talented director. I just really appreciated what he did for not only just horror films, but cinema as a whole. And to have a film like Scream be one of my earliest introductions into the genre of horror, he'll always have a special place in my heart as a director. But on a more positive note, let's discuss Scream. As I mentioned, it was released a year before I was born. I was born in 1997. It was released in 1996. So it does have that sort of mid to late 90s horror aesthetic and horror vibe, which is something I'll mention a little bit later. But going into what I love about this movie, for starters, the opening scene is one of the most iconic and memorable opening scenes to any horror film ever. And if you haven't seen it, it's essentially Drew Barrymore about to watch a scary film at home alone when chaos ensues. And it is just one of the best opening scenes of all time, like I mentioned. I absolutely love everything about this opening, from the way it's shot, to the music, to Drew Barrymore's performance, to just every little detail they added into it. The sound design adds so much to this scene. One of the things that I noticed on my rewatch for this video, and side note, I will probably not be able to rewatch every film that I'm going to talk about in this series, so some films are going to be a little fresher in my mind than others, but Scream is one that I never have a problem watching. So I watched it last night again before filming this video, and I never caught it before. But one of the coolest things is the second that she looks um, towards where she thinks that the person is the killer. It's the first time that you really get a sense that the killer's actually there and not just prank calling her, and it's a real serious moment in the opening scene. You hear the dogs barking. You hear the characters' dogs barking, almost as if they saw the person who's wearing the Ghostface costume. And it's just a small detail, but it really adds so much to the scene. And another thing that I think is really well done is the fact that she lives in this very big, very spacious house. Like, she doesn't live in a small house in like this suburban neighborhood. Like you would see in Halloween, where there's a lot of cramped corridors and a lot of tight spaces. This is a very, like I said, spacious house with a lot of room, and you're watching her in this house, and you're like, this is a really big home. Like, there's a lot of places to hide. There's a lot of places to probably escape to, and to escape the killer. And the fact that they're able to make it feel so claustrophobic just through the writing and the directing, and just the musical composition that adds so much to this scene. It's just so well done. And of course, you have the very iconic lines, the very quotable lines from the movie, like "What's your favorite scary movie?" And just so many great things. It's the first time we ever hear the voice changed Ghostface on the other line of the phone, which to this day people still will use. There's apps and stuff that will change your voice to sound like Ghostface. And what I love about Ghostface's voice in the opening scene is just it starts off as sort of just like this creepy, very sort of annoying kind of voice. Like it's a little scratchy, but it's very reserved at first in the phone call.
Hello?
Why don't you want to talk to me?
Who is this?
You tell me your name, I'll tell you mine.
But then there's just this moment where she's about to hang up on them again, and it just goes for it and it gets really aggressive and it just flips the scene totally into a new direction, and it makes it really terrifying, really unsettling, really scary, and at that moment you're just like, all right, this girl's fucked. She is not getting out of this situation. It's just such a way to introduce you to this film, to this killer. It really sets the tone for the rest of this movie, and the tone of this movie is something that I really would like to discuss. You'll hear me on this channel a lot talk about tone and atmosphere, and I don't think it's as important in a lot of other films as it is in a horror film. One of the most important, aspects of a horror film is the atmosphere, is the tone of the film. If the tone and the atmosphere aren't there, then you're not gonna really feel like you're watching a scary movie. You're just gonna feel like you're watching mindless people get killed. You're just gonna feel like you're watching violence, and things just sort of happen. Atmosphere and tone in a horror film is just so vital to the experience of watching the movie, and this film does it incredibly well, carrying over that sort of mise-en-scene and the directing capabilities from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Wes Craven just is able to craft this very unsettling, very eerie tone from the start of the film. You always feel like the characters are not safe. You always feel like the killer is lurking. You always just have this, great sense of dread. Like, you always feel like something bad is going to happen. And again, that's just a testament to how good Craven is as a director. He's just so good at crafting really unsettling, really terrifying scenes that sort of get under your skin, really make you kind of look over your shoulder, and he does that in such a great way in this movie.
Randy, that's so unoriginal. I'm disappointed in you.
Maybe that's because I'm not Randy.
So, who are you?
The question isn't who am I? The question is, where am I?
One of the best parts about this film, outside of the scary elements, is this movie is incredibly funny. I view this movie as much of a comedy as I do a horror film, and it's very seldom that films are able to blend the two genres so seamlessly. Usually one ends up encompassing the other, but there's some really genuinely scary moments in this film, as well as some just really, really funny moments. Matthew Lloyd's performance as Stu is absolutely hilarious. There is just so many funny scenes and funny lines of dialogue in this movie.
You gotta find me first, you pansy-ass mama's boy!
Fucking hit me with the phone, Dick!
And it never feels forced. It never feels like Craven is trying to force a joke into the film. It always feels like it naturally comes from the characters, from the writing, and from just what's happening in the scene. It never feels like he's trying to put comedy in for the sake of trying to lighten up the mood. It just seems like it, naturally happens. These are high school kids, and high school kids are stupid. They do not understand the gravity of a lot of situations. And no offense to high school kids, I was a high school kid not too long ago, and even I was, sort of like that. Something serious, something tragic happens, and your first instinct is to try to make a joke out of it. Your first instinct is to try to laugh about it. And I think, a lot of people do that who aren't high school students. Laughter is a great way to process grief and to process trauma. But it's so well done in this movie. And although the actors do look a little old, they look like they're in their 20s, like most horror films and like most films in general, it's very rare that you'll get a cast of high school students actually played by high school students, or even actors that look like high school students. So yes, they do look a little bit old, but to me, they act like high school kids. They're very obnoxious, they're very goofy, but they're also very likable in certain senses. I think a lot of the characters in this movie, even the ones who you're supposed to root against and not like, are very fun and interesting characters. And that's another just positive of this film, is just it has a cast of really fun, really entertaining, and more often than not likable characters. I think the female lead of the film, Neve Campbell, who plays Sydney Prescott, is a great, great female protagonist, especially considering a lot of 80s and 90s horror films, they didn't exactly have the best protagonist. It was more about the killer, but this film definitely tried to focus more on a sole character and her life and her experiences. They do a great job of building up her character and giving her depth, because not only is there, these horrifying killings happening within the story that we're watching, but there's a lot of backstory in this film. The star of the film, Neve Campbell, playing Sidney Prescott, her mother was murdered previously a year ago. So you have that added element of emotional weight. You have that element of trauma added to her character, which really makes her very emotionally relatable. It makes her easy to connect with, to root for, to understand her position. You also have a young Skeet Ulrich in this film playing her boyfriend, and he is also fantastic in this movie. I sometimes forget, because I do watch Riverdale. I watch it with my friends, but we have a good time watching it. It's just a fun, stupid, silly, cringy show, but it's really a good time if you watch it with a group of friends. But Skeeter Ulrich, the actor, is in that show, and I sometimes forget that he was, like, in Scream, which is crazy, because I saw him in Scream first, but now he's just so, like, prolific in my head as F.P. Jones in Riverdale that it's hard to, like, separate the character and the actor. But, I'm getting away from my point. The characters in this movie are really fun. They're really entertaining. As a film geek and as a film nerd, I acknowledge that I would probably be Randy, the creepy movie nerd in the movie who his whole identity is films. So I sort of relate to that character the most. But again, the characters are really fun. They're really interesting. There's a lot to love about this movie. I will talk about some negatives. In my first two episodes, I really didn't go into negatives because I consider both of those films to be masterpieces, The Exorcist and The Lighthouse. So I'm going to get into my flaws with this film. Basically, I have two main flaws. One, this is a late 90s film, so the dialogue is a bit cringy at times. There's a lot of scenes where the dialogue feels a little forced, it feels a little unnatural, and it has nothing to do with the performances. The actors all do a fine job. But some of the scenes are a little unintentionally goofy. And while maybe they were meant to be goofy, to add into this sort of, comedy aspect of the film, there was a couple scenes where I'm like, this is meant to be taken seriously, and I just can't help but laugh at it. There are funny scenes that I think are intentionally funny, and there are scenes where I'm like, yeah, this definitely doesn't seem like what they were going for, the emotion that they wanted to invoke from me. There's just some sillier scenes, some sillier lines of dialogue, some very cringy and cheesy lines of dialogue. But again, it's a late 90s film, so it's hard to hold a movie that came out over 20 years ago at fault for having some cringy dialogue and some cringy, scenes as a whole. But another problem that I have with this movie, and it's one that I never really had until I rewatched it last night, was the very flat lighting in the film. And I'm not sure if this was intentional, because the film does have a lot of parody elements. It is a very meta horror film, which is something that I didn't really talk about in my positives, but it's definitely a highlight of the film. It sort of follows in the trend of Wes Craven's fifth film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, Wes Craven's A New Nightmare, which sort of tackled horror in a very meta, very self-aware way, and Scream does that. It's a film that has characters that live inside a world that understand the rules of horror films. These characters have seen horror films, they know the classics, they know the rules to surviving a horror film, and it sort of plays into the film, and they sort of poke fun and prod at that, which I also think is just really great that a director like Wes Craven, who was a part of building these tropes and these cliches, is one that's able to sort of laugh at them and also poke fun at them. It's just sort of, this other level of self-awareness, this other level of meta humor that I think really works in this film's favor.
Rules? Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number one, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
And maybe the flat lighting was a play on that, because you go back and you watch a lot of 70s and 80s horror films, and there's a lot of deep shadows, there's a lot of contrast. There's a lot of scenes where, the lighting source it feels like it's a one lighting source lighting setup. So it adds a lot of depth to the shot. Whereas this film, it has a very flat look to it for a majority of the film. There's not a lot of scenes that feel like there's a lot of depth going on with the lighting. The shadows are pretty non-existent. The blacks are not very crushed. It just sort of has a very flat very neutral look to it, and that may be playing into the fact that it isn't trying to be a quote-unquote conventional horror film. It's trying to play on the tropes of horror films. So maybe that was the reason for that, but I still would have preferred the visual elements to be a little bit stronger. It's not as apparent when the scenes are taking place outside at night, but anytime they're in a house, anytime it's a daytime scene, the contrast is just so low. There's a lack of depth to the image, and I just would have liked a little bit more visually interesting stuff to happen in the film. The last thing I want to talk about is one I didn't mention in the positives, and I wanted to talk about it. The kills in this movie, I think, are really great. I think they're really creative, really original, really entertaining to watch. Maybe that makes me a messed up human, but I think if you're watching a slasher film, a part of you just wants to see really creative, really fun kills. And there are some really fun, entertaining ones in this movie. Some that are a little illogical and don't make a lot of sense, but as far as the blood and the gore factor goes, I think it does a really good job in that department. I think if you're going into this not really caring about the story or the characters, you're at least going to be satisfied by the deaths in this movie, which I think are, again, really fun, really entertaining. Alright, so that is all I have to say about Scream. It is one of my earliest introductions into the genre. It is a film that to this day I really do love watching. I usually watch it once a year in October, and I have it on DVD, and I would have liked to have pulled it out and shown it to you guys because there's something on the cover of that DVD that I really would like to address, but I can't find it, which is weird because I own the first three all on DVD. And unfortunately, I cannot seem to find the first two. Like, they just went missing. I still have the third one, which is unfortunate because I consider the third one to be the worst in the franchise. But, yeah, anyway, I do have the first three on DVD. I normally watch the first one on DVD. They've got some cool special features on there and stuff that I always like to check out. But yeah, that is all I'm going to say about this movie. Let me know what you think about it, if you have seen it, if you like it, if you don't like it. Let me know in the comments down below. If you think it holds up or you think it doesn't, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But yeah, that is all I'm going to say for this film. As always, if you liked the video, make sure to click the like button and subscribe to me if you want to hear more from me. Make sure to click the little bell notification so you get notified when I post new videos. Look forward to more content coming soon, more episodes in my 31 Nights, 31 Frights series. Remember, I'm reviewing a new horror film every day of October, so keep a lookout for that, and I will see you guys next time.